And I'll just dive in. I do want to say, if you're interested in what I'm saying tonight, there's an organization locally in Fresno called the California Prisons Moratorium Project that you might want to check out, and I'm happy to repeat that for you during the Q&A, but they have a really nice website, and they're doing the kind of work that I'm talking about. So I'll just dive in. The Harbor Gateway neighborhood of Los Angeles recently joined many communities across the country in banning the residence of some people convicted of sex offenses. They achieved this result through the building of a pocket park, which is a tiny public park. While pocket parks have long been a strategy for introducing relatively inexpensive public green spaces into areas where land prices are really expensive and development options limited, they are now being put to a new use. The neighborhood's decision to name a 1,000-square-foot plot of land a park bans the legal residence of some people convicted of sex offenses because of state legislation that prohibits those registered as sex offenders still on parole from residing within 2,000 feet of a park or a school. Once a technique for introducing more public space into a neighborhood, pocket parks are now being used as an extension of the carceral system. A resident of Harbor Gateway, Patty O'Connell, remarks of this new use of pocket parks, quote, and this was just from, I think it was from the LA Times, "I think it's great. I just feel sorry for wherever they're moving to. It's scary that there are sex offenders around all these little kids here." And that's the end of that quote. While O'Connell does not say so explicitly, it seems she thinks the parks are great because they will eliminate those who have been convicted of sex offenses from her community. Considerable research suggests, however, that this new use of pocket parks could actually make the neighborhood less safe. People displaced by pocket parks may not simply be displaced to another community. As Jill Levinson, and if you Google Jill Levinson, she's the big name in this research right now. Jill Levinson, professor of psychology and an expert on sexual violence, notes, quote, "Since the vast majority, and this is 80 to 95% of residential properties in densely populated metropolitan areas are within 2,500 feet of a school, park, or daycare center, housing options can be diminished to a degree where sex offenders become homeless or transient. This transience undermines the very purpose of sex offender registries to track and monitor where sex offenders live and creates other barriers to successful reintegration," end quote. Further, of the new pocket park strategy and its tendency to make sex offenders homeless rather than forcing them to relocate, member of the California Sex Offender Management Board, which is a public entity, Janet Neely comments, quote, "It's counterproductive to public safety because when you have nothing to lose, you are much more likely to commit a crime than when you are rebuilding your life," end quote. Residency restrictions, in other words, are so restrictive that they can make it impossible for people on sex offender registries to find housing. Thus, an attempt to eliminate people from a neighborhood often leads to their internal displacement and works against the aim of making the neighborhood safer. As the proliferation of pocket parks and similar strategies indicate, communities across the US are increasingly responding to harm by attempting to eliminate those who harm. Yet, such a response not only does not make communities safer, it cannot do so. So the research shows pretty clearly it's not making communities safer. I'm making the further claim that it's not going to be able to make communities safer, no matter how much we do it. To understand why, I turn to the work of Judith Butler, whose insights into precarity and vulnerability offer a way to understand the failure of pocket parks and related strategies to bolster public safety. Butler argues that we must acknowledge that our vulnerability can never be fully eliminated. We are all precarious lives, and I'll get into this difference between precarity and precariousness. However, while all lives are precarious according to Butler, we are not therefore equally vulnerable. So we're all sort of in this room right now. If a tree fell on it, we would all be harmed by that tree. We all have that capacity to be harmed. We're just vulnerable to the world in certain ways, and this is a fact of our embodiment. Our precariousness, though, can be differentially and systematically exploited to produce precarity. And she calls it that politically induced condition which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks of support and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death, end quote. So if you think about the siting of toxic waste dumps in the United States, anybody know where toxic waste dumps tend to be sited? Carolyn, do you mind?
Poor Black communities?
And it doesn't even, actually it's Black communities. We can even controlling for income, toxic waste sites tend to be in Black communities. So that's increasing the precarity of those people's lives, right? We're all susceptible to being harmed by toxic waste, but how we site those toxic waste dumps makes a difference about how vulnerable we are to that toxic waste, right? If you don't live in a neighborhood with a toxic waste site, you're less vulnerable to it, okay? So pocket parks and similar strategies that seek to eliminate people from communities effectively make the lives of those who have committed sexual offenses more precarious to the point of precarity, making housing difficult, and they do not make communities safer. Butler's work helps us move from thinking about the failure of pocket parks as a strategy on the one hand to the conditions of that failure on the other, and thereby move from considering a policy to considering the ontological conditions of our safety, and I promise that the ontological conditions of our safety will seem more important once I'm done. I hope I can make good on that promise. While Butler's work is a critical resource for thinking through the problems of the eliminative strategy of pocket parks in combating sexual abuse and assault, she does not develop robust alternatives. So she doesn't tell us what else to do. Thus, I turn to the work of one of the groups of people who have been developing alternatives, an organization known as Generation 5. Generation 5 has a rather simple vision: to eliminate child abuse within 5 generations. They work to do so through a transformative justice framework, which requires addressing individual harm while also fostering community liberation. So in a transformative justice framework, whether elaborated by Generation 5 or other groups who are working in this framework, harms are never treated in isolation as the action of one individual at one point in time. Using that framework, the transformative justice framework, Generation 5 does not offer a prescription for achieving safe communities. Rather, they call on us to consciously and consensually take on this experiment in, quote, developing new practices that we believe will bring about safety and justice, end quote. Their work is to, quote, build the capacity of communities to increase justice internally to the communities. We can think of transformative justice approaches as driven by the question, how is this harm possible in our community? Generation 5 approaches the problem of child sexual abuse as a problem that can only be addressed through transforming the ways we live together. Rather than narrowly and singularly focusing on individuals who commit violent acts, Generation 5 focuses on the conditions, norms, and practices that allowed violence to occur or even fostered it. Thus, when Generation 5 speaks of the need for transformation and accountability, they do not only mean the personal transformation and accountability of those who have harmed others, though they do certainly mean that. Generation 5 does not individualize violence, reducing an understanding of instances of violence to simplistic narratives of perpetrator and victim. This is sometimes called the victim-perpetrator dyad. But rather, they understand violence as something that occurs within, affects, and is perpetuated by communities of people. In doing so, they consider the actions of individuals within a communal context to understand harm in a way that we cannot fully understand or intervene against if it continues to be treated as an isolated event, isolated either in time or between two people, extracted from systems of communal responsibility. In light of the proliferation of pocket parks and other eliminative strategies such as incarceration, sex offender registries, and zero tolerance in schools, as well as their failure to make communities safer, Generation 5's resistance to the exploitation of the precariousness of some lives for the safety and profit of others makes their work a critical resource for all those who wish to end child sexual abuse and other forms of sexual violence. Moreover, they have begun to imagine how we might organize social interdependence differently, so how we can organize our common lives together differently to make us all safer. The imaginative work is also critical if we are to question and transform current systems. But first, however, to understand why we'd go with Generation 5 on this, we must understand the predominant response to sexual abuse and assault we currently permit and perpetuate. So pocket parks. How does this work? What's the system pocket parks are occurring in? In the US, many communities use pocket parks as a strategy within a larger approach to sexual abuse and assault. Pocket parks rely on state practices designed to label some people as sex offenders, and which remove some people with prior prison sentences from communities after they've served the term of a punitive sentence. So you're on a sex offender registry after you get out of prison, after you've already served your time. Like pocket parks, and for very similar reasons, incarceration is unlikely to increase the safety of prisons. And this is all over the literature on prisons. In their report based on a meta-analysis of 117 studies beginning in 1958, Paula Smith, Claire Gauguin, and Paul Gondreau conclude, quote, prisons and intermediate sanctions should not be used with the expectation of reducing criminal behavior. So we don't use prisons to reduce criminal behavior. It's not, sometimes people call this the failure of the incarceration model, but we might wonder, what is it succeeding at? But it's not succeeding at making us safer. Further, as Mark Maurer and Meta Chenzi Lind have argued, the widespread nature of mass incarceration means that entire communities bear the negative economic, social, emotional, and health consequences of incarceration, which disproportionately affects children. So even if children were not directly vulnerable to the prison system, which they are through mechanisms like curfew laws, status crimes of all sorts, and zero tolerance policies in schools, the destabilization of their communities contributes to the differential exposure of children to harm. In Butler's language, these practices increase children's precarity. While the next step in state management of people convicted of sex offenses, sex offender registries, do not physically remove people from communities, they do continue to mark people convicted of sex offenses within a community after they have undergone state punishment for their offense. Human Rights Watch, which in 2007 released the first comprehensive report on sex offender policies in the US, found, quote, it's a long quote, but bear with me, the consequences to registrants are devastating. Their privacy is shattered. Many cannot get or keep jobs or find affordable housing. Registrants' children have been harassed at school. Registrant spouses have also been forced to leave their jobs. Former offenders included on online registries have been hounded from their homes, had rocks thrown through their windows, and feces left on their doorsteps. They have been beaten, burned, stabbed, and had their homes set on fire. At least 4 registrants have been targeted and killed by strangers who found their names and addresses through online registries. Other registrants have been driven to suicide, end quote.